Leadership, the action of leading a group of people or an organization. Sounds simple, right? It's not, especially during turbulent times. My name is Randall Palm, and over my 20-plus year career, I've been blessed to work with some of the great leaders in the industry. I've seen many leaders take teams and organizations to new heights, while others have struggled to empower, reward, and foster a culture of diversity and inclusion. Over the past year, leaders have been challenged like no other time I can remember, from external forces like the pandemic and social injustices, to the implications of these within their own organizations, which in some cases has completely changed or accelerated their business model. As we navigate the waters of these changes, I wanted to talk with people I consider innovative leaders about their approach to leadership, how they've applied that experience over the past year, and what they've learned. Well, welcome back to the pod, everyone. I am really excited today to have a special guest, Andy Ellis. Andy is the former CSO at Akamai, a real visionary technology and business executive leader who I've worked with for 2 decades, and probably with the last decade a little bit closer than the first one. But really excited to have Andy on to get his perspective on this topic of leadership and a little bit of a different spin that we're going to put on it today. Andy is also a member of the CSO Hall of Fame. And before we get started, Andy, I'll let you introduce yourself. And I also wanted to ask, how do you get yourself into the CSO Hall of Fame? It's kind of you have to hit 3,000 hits or 300, 500 home runs, or what's involved in that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Randall. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
The CSO Hall of Fame, it's a little arcane. I think it's sort of like the NFL Hall of Fame. You never quite know what the voters are going to bat. But I do have to say, one of the high points of my career is I have beat Tom Brady one more time to something. I was born in California before he was. I moved to Massachusetts before him. I married Giselle before he did. I even helped lead a Boston organized to dominance. You could argue over whether Akamai or the Patriots got there first, and now I got into the Hall of Fame first. I think the only thing he beat me to is moving to Tampa Bay. So I had a lot of friends asking if I'm going to Florida. Not anytime soon.
No, it's I'm sure that's a cool thing. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that. But
it really is. They pick about 9 people a year. This is only the second year. I'm actually the only person who's not currently a CSO who was selected, which was sort of an entertaining little thing when they announce everybody in their current gigs. I'm currently an operating partner at YL Ventures, so I've moved over into the VC space where I get to work actually across a dozen companies instead of just one.
Yeah, no, it's great. So a little bit about, I think most folks are familiar with you, but maybe just a little bit about your background. And I was going to ask kind of what's a day in the life of Andy Ellis look like today, now that you have, working with lots of cool companies and have a little bit more freedom to do maybe more passion projects, I assume, than you have the past 20 years.
Yeah, so every day is very different. And I thought as a CSO that my days were, radically different from day to day. And it's even more so right now. The biggest change actually is, and this isn't meant as a ding on large companies, but once you've been in a company for a really long time, there becomes an inertia. There's a lot of time that you spend in meetings that nobody actually really wants to be there. It's a necessary meeting, but you're more there defensively. And I don't have any of that in my day. There's very little bureaucracy. Almost all the companies I'm dealing with are 100 people or smaller.
Yeah.
There's a few that have, crossed that number, but it really is that startup world. Now, on the flip side, that also means that when something comes up, everything is moving much faster.
Right.
And so, the old model of, I'll get back to that in a month, doesn't really work. But it's really fantastic. Like every meeting that I walk into, I want to be there. The people I'm with want me to be there, and they want to be there. Because if those 3 things weren't true, we wouldn't have the conversation.
Right.
And that's fantastic. So I meet with CEOs of these companies. I'm meeting with my peers across the industry because a lot of them are really interested in sort of what we're doing. And I'm not sure if you remember, as a CSO, I had this canonical vendor response template that people would send me cold email. I'd click and reply, and they'd get I'm just going to get you to know really fast.
Yeah.
And now I'm on the other side of that. Somebody who's representing a dozen startups. I'm often saying, "Hey, Randall, I got some companies you might be interested in."
Right.
And what I've tried to do is take the same spirit of that to recognize that 99% of vendor business interactions end in no.
Right.
And that's okay. That's not a bad thing. So how quickly can I get you to a no? So if I say, hey, Randall, like, this is Andy, you trust me. I'm just going to give you plain language. Here's what these companies do. I expect you to say no to at least 9 of the 10, maybe all 10. But if one is interesting, let me know. And then and only then will I do the introduction. I'm giving you that opportunity to get to know really fast. They're very succinct messages, exactly what I asked vendors for. So far, nobody has yelled at me too much for that conversation.
What's funny, it's being in sales, running inside sales and BDR, SDR organizations, maybe a different topic, but it is becoming more like the traditional consumer space where we're trying to find someone in market for that. Now it's the shirt that I want. How do they know my shirt? We're trying to find people in market for products, reach out at the right time. And there's a whole science behind that, which is maybe a different conversation. So the other kind of funny thing is, not funny thing, but I pinged Andy about this leadership conversation. He's like, oh yeah, I'm writing a book about that. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting timing of it. I'm sure you're full of ideas, so it's a great opportunity. So maybe it's a little bit about the book that you're writing, and I'm sure that's kind of a fascinating. Leadership, there's lots of layers to that, but maybe a little bit more on that.
So there are, and let me tell you why I started writing this book. Actually, was I've read a lot of books on leadership. In fact, we joked right beforehand because Randall said, "Oh, there's this great book about 4 presidents," and I pulled it up. It was actually sitting on my desk. But oftentimes when you read these books on leadership, sometimes they're great stories about people, but many of them often have one thing they're trying to tell you. And it could have been written as a tweet, and it's just expanded out into 400 pages. Especially some of the ones that are written by sort of the consultants, the experts in the space. We can summarize a lot of Jeffrey Moore's work. It's fascinating work, but at the end of the day, it's one tweet. And a lot of us don't have time to read books just to sort of get that one tweet out, especially if it's not going to be enjoyable. And there's a second problem, is that they often treat leadership as if there is one way to do it. Like for that Mandalorian, this is the way that you will do leadership, and I have spoken. And neither of those things I think are really appropriate. First of all, I don't think there's one way to leadership. Like, my style of leadership and your style of leadership are always going to be different. There will be things that are common between them, practices we might both use, because that's useful for us in the environment that we're in. As a leader at Akamai of an information security team that had 100 people, like I literally had 100 people working for me, and now I'm advising companies that don't even have that many people. But I got to use tools for that organization that had almost no turnover, 40% women, because we had built and grown and established. Those tools, I can't just walk into some other environment and just say, oh, hey, I'm going to use these tools when I'm working with a 15-person Israeli startup that doesn't know me. We haven't invested that work. I'm going to have to use different tools,
different culture, the whole thing.
So that was sort of one motivator, was to say, how do I write a book that is useful in that? I'll come back to my solution in a moment. But then the other motivator is, I actually think most people don't understand the definition of leadership. I hear 2 definitions all throughout my career. One definition is that leadership is about getting the most out of your people. Right? And to me, that's what management is. Like, that is actually the job of management, but that's not what leadership is. If we use that as a definition of leadership, like, there's a lot of people who got the most out of their people. You could think about Lenin and Stalin. Like, they got an awful lot out of their people before they killed them. But that doesn't make them leaders we would like to emulate. There's another one that says leadership is about having a vision and getting people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, which makes us sound like used car salespeople. Not clear that's the model we want. I believe that leadership is actually about investment. It's about how do you invest more into people, develop them, grow them. Now, when you do that, you get more out of them. You achieve the goal of management. And when they see that you do have their better interests at heart, then they're more likely to follow you places they wouldn't otherwise. So you achieve both of those goals. But those are goals. Those aren't the primary mission. They're sort of side effects. And so I approached the book and I said, how do I write this? And so it's 55 chapters. And each chapter, it's almost like the bathroom leader instead of a bathroom reader. They're designed to be read standalone. Each one is, here's an aphorism. And here's a little anecdote about that aphorism. And then I try to be a clear message that tells you, how you can do this. and it's organized as personal leadership, practices that you as a leader should do for yourself. You have to invest in yourself to invest in your people. Then team leadership, and then organizational leadership.
Yeah, I had a question for you on that, because I think that, and I want to, maybe we can switch into kind of the role of the CISO moving forward as a leader within an organization. Do you think leadership is something that can be taught? Do you think you're born with it? Do you think it's a skill set that can be developed? Because I do think that there are people that, I listened to your podcast yesterday on Tech Perspective with Tony Bradley, and there was a lot in there around him saying, hey, I don't think I'm a leader. I don't want to be a leader. Like, I'm good at what I do. I don't, driving followership, getting most of the people is not, I just would rather do it myself. And I think a lot of CISOs historically are like that. They're kind of like, okay, let me go tackle this problem. I'm not really thinking about like leading a team or getting the most out of it.
They're technically oriented.
Development is not necessarily top of mind. So do you think leadership is something that is kind of innate, or can you grow into it, or what's your read there?
So I think that leadership is like almost all skills. There are attributes that are somewhat innate, and there are skills that can be taught. If you knew me 30 years ago, you would have looked at me and said, this is not somebody who's leadership potential, right? I was a little obnoxious. I'm sort of at the edge of the,
you've overgrown, you're not.
I've overgrown some of that.
Outgrown that.
I'm at the edge of the autism spectrum. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but I have a hard time understanding human beings. So I dedicated my life to learning how humans react in situations, because it got in my way. Now, most people might look at that and say, wow, you don't understand how humans operate. How are you a leader? It's like, no, now I have a lot of rules that I have learned over time about how people operate. And I have people I trust to tell me when my rules are wrong. That I say, oh, I'm going to go do this. And it's often my wife, because she's often there when I have crazy ideas. And she's like, yeah, that's just not going to go over the way you think it's going to. And let's have a conversation about how somebody else might perceive that. The staff that I had at Akamai would often be my test beds for that. I'd say, hey, let's go do a thing. So I've learned this. This is not a place that I started out and, oh yeah, I was obviously a naturally charismatic person in high school. Absolutely not. This is developed and practiced, and just like any other skill, you can get good at it. Now, it helps if you have some of the fundamentals. I'm never going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback. So it doesn't matter how much I go practice. I'm not going to beat Tom Brady at that. But he's never going to be a Hall of Fame CSO. At least I hope not. Tom, don't take that as a challenge.
Don't put it past him. Don't put it past him. I think that's right. I think, and you mentioned this earlier, I think it's kind of finding your way, right? I've had plenty of leaders, people that well, who I've tried to emulate. And as soon as I try to be them, I try to act like them,
it's bad.
I think that, the being, being real and coming across, being, authentic, I think is a word that I use a lot around leadership. What is your authentic self, and kind of working on the skill sets underneath that, because trying to be, I've gone in lots of meetings and tried to be, this person that can be that person, and it just falls on its face, because it's just not,
because it's not you. And I think the other challenge we often have is people equate leadership with management. And so that, like, take Tony, for example. Now I have to tell him we're talking about him on this podcast. Tony is a leader.
I reached out to him yesterday too. I said, hey, I really appreciate your talk. So hopefully,
but he doesn't see himself as a leader because he doesn't see himself as a manager. Like, he's like, I want to go do it myself. Okay, but are you sharing your perspective so that other people can grow? I mean, that's leadership. Just because you're not the manager. How many people have we known through our careers who were individual contributors that everybody looked up to? They gave back to the people around them. Like, we know a lot of people in the sales force who are like that. That when they figured out, oh, I can make more money doing this and retire more quota, like, they didn't hide that. They went and told everybody around, said, hey, if you do this, this is working. That's leadership. You invested in the people around you, and that's a step in leadership.
I think there's this, people have a little bit of a false sense that, I'm not a leader because I don't manage people. I'm not a leader. And you're like, no, I'll give you an example. I think during COVID, it was more traditional leadership. Hey, team, let's get together. Let's, we're here for you. And, for me personally, then we, go into the summer with George Floyd and all the social injustices, where I'm a 44-year-old white guy who hasn't dealt with a lot of the stuff that's happened. I'm looking at my team of people that have, and trying to get their perspective on it, because they're leading the conversation. I may be the one creating the space for it, but I'm listening, I'm learning, from them. And I don't know that those people would say, hey, I'm a leader, necessarily. I'm an individual contributor. I'm not, I don't have people working for me. But man, there's a lot of leadership shown during that time. It didn't come from me as a traditional, as a traditional leader.
You, as a traditional leader, have that opportunity to create the space for them to practice leadership, to make it safer for them to practice leadership. And that's sort of key to growing new leaders, which is to look at opportunities. And first of all, it's a horrible reason to give people an opportunity, but we should find more reasons that aren't horrible. Everybody who works for you should be working on their leadership skills, even if it just starts with their personal leadership, how they lead themselves. You as an organizational leader, it's about creating a safe space for them to practice. One of the leadership talents that I talk about is apologizing, because I hate blame culture, but it persists everywhere. Humans love to blame other humans, but it's the death of a company. If you seek to blame another human, people run. So I would always practice, I'd apologize. If somebody on my team made a mistake, I would apologize on their behalf. Great. The whole goal was to neutralize the pain that would come from them to them when they tried something new. So I'm going to give you a chance to lead in this space, to try something new. So we explicitly talked about an apology budget. I would tell people, if I never have to apologize on your behalf, if you work for me and I don't apologize on your behalf at least once in the year, you're not taking enough risk. And that is so backwards. Like, how many senior executives actually say that? Right? That can you imagine CEOs saying, "Oh, I expect to apologize to the board on your behalf at least once a year"? No, like that's just so wrong from a normal corporate perspective. But to do that is so empowering to the people underneath you, because they know you've got their back. You're not going to throw them under the bus just because something goes wrong.
I was listening to I've been using this app called Blinkist, which is like just a quick cliff notes on books, right? The news, not even new anymore, but Simon Sinek's book, and it was talking about Ford Motors, and Malala came in when they were kind of, weren't doing well, and there was a real, before his leadership, everyone was afraid to give bad news. It was afraid to tell the CEO something was wrong, because he would berate him and fire him in front of everybody. And he came in and said, hey, when somebody gave him bad news, he stood up and gave him started clapping and said, thank you for giving me bad news. Everyone give me bad news. Like, don't be afraid to communicate bad news or make mistakes, because I'd rather have that than everyone, polish this thing up and everyone look good. We're not going to move forward as a company, get out of where we're at doing that.
Well, additionally, we exist to take risk. Any organization, whether it's a company or not, the only reason you exist is risk taking. Now, you might be taking risk in hopes of reducing risk elsewhere, but if you never learn about the risks that fail, because nobody's willing to give you the bad news, you never get feedback that says, oh, hey, this category of thing that I thought would be successful 90% of the time, I hear about the success 100%. So I think, great, but it's really failing 60% of the time. Like, that's a massive swing, but nobody tells me about the 60% failures. They only tell me about the 40% successes. Well, wait, I'm putting all my eggs in that basket because I think that's remarkably successful, but it's going to kill us because we keep failing at a massive rate. Yeah, I wanted to maybe we can kind of shift the conversation a little bit back to the CISO and the role. I think 5 years ago, I don't think most organizations would say, hey, the CISO is a leader within the company. They're driving. I think I think you've always had a seat at the table with the board. You've always talked to the board. I think you're maybe a little bit of a unicorn in that regard, meaning just the access to people. I'm not sure. So walk me through the CSO role 5 years ago as a leader within the company to a year ago or 15 months ago when COVID hits and organizations are having to engage the CSO around working from home, risk assessments, all the things that kind of change with digital transformation, and maybe where you think the CSO role is going moving forward. So I think the role definitely has been shifting, and I've been speaking with a lot of my peers, especially even more so over the last 6 weeks. And I think if you go back 5 years, there's no like average CISO 5 years ago, just
That's
to be
true.
clear. But I
Yeah.
think the challenge is that CISO means so many different things in so many different companies. First of all, in almost no companies, there's a small handful, but nowhere do you generally see the CSO reporting to the CEO. It
Right.
really is the last C-level executive that doesn't report to the CEO on a regular basis. We're starting to see, other things get titled CXO in other places now, but
Right.
generally you talk about, you have a chief revenue officer, it's your head of sales, they should report to the CEO, the CTO, the CIO, the chief human resources officer, the chief marketing officer, but the CSO is almost always at least one step
And
down.
I would say, like, just not to interrupt you, but I would say the CIO 5 years ago, very few reported to the CEO.
Right. So you've seen the CIO has gotten that seat at the table. It's been, I think, probably 10 to 5 years ago was sort of that big shift happened. The CSO shift hasn't yet happened. What has happened that's interesting is, as you talked about, which is the board reporting. I think that, I was probably reporting to the board 10 years ago, infrequently. 5 years ago, it became every quarter I was in front of the audit committee. But it's sort of interesting that I'm reporting to the audit committee, but I don't work for the CEO. Like there's an interesting disconnect that I think companies are seeing, and I see this more and more when I talk to peers. I have CSOs, one who came to me recently to sort of vent at their challenges, where there's not great news that they have to report. The board wants to hear it, but the executive management doesn't want the board to hear it. So they get put at the end of the board schedule.
It's a no-win situation, right?
It's a no-win situation. They're like, what am I supposed to do? And so there were a couple quarters where they put at the end of the schedule, and then they're like, it was really weird that everybody ahead of me went like 5 minutes long, and therefore there was no time left for me. And then I wasn't invited to a meeting, and everybody went short, and so my boss delivered a security update without me in the room, which got satisfied the board for a little while. And so it was fascinating to sort of hear this dynamic going on. And I think that's a challenge, which is because the CSO is still viewed as an advisor rather than a leader in the business and a part of the management team. Realistically, it's challenging when the board wants to hear from them about how they're leading the security program when they're not really leading the security program. They're trying to fit it in around the rest of the business priorities.
Right.
That is changing, it's evolving, but I think we've got another 5 or 10 years before we're really going to see, the CSO as a, executive seat, reports to the CEO, and truly is leading and governing security across the business in the same way that, HR is led across the business and marketing is led across the business.
Right. And I saw that, I spent a lot of time with CIOs. I think to your point about 5 years ago, the CIO went from a technical leader to a business leader.
Yep.
Right. And most CIOs I talk to today, they're not that savvy as you'd expect, frankly, on the technology, but they have people who are. And that kind of like a little bit of let it go to your team around leading and hiring great people and empowering them and
then trusting them when they tell you what's really going on. Because the challenge that you do have as a business executive rather than a technical executive is when somebody asks you a question, you will give the answer in the widest context which is often the best answer, right? Everything looks rosy. If you asked the CIO and said, hey, all of our systems patched, the CIO says, well, of course they are, but they're not thinking about the systems that are off in the shadows that they don't control. They're talking about their core, our core Windows servers are all patched. But that wasn't what the board really asked. A technical executive might say, well, in this domain we're great, but in these other places we're not so great, and that's okay. But I just don't want you to think we're perfect everywhere. And that's I think a nuanced conversation that boards need to have. When I talk to directors, I hear that many of them want to have that conversation. Their job is to make sure that companies are making appropriate risk choices, which means they have to understand the downsides as well to know if that was appropriate. If we hide the downsides from them, then we're not letting them do their job either.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too how the boards are changing, right? I mean, boards are there's ex-CIOs on them, there's CISOs. We have an ex-CISO of Amazon on our board, right? I mean, that boards are saying we need someone who can kind of bridge this language barrier that we've got and kind of speak it, right? So I think boards are changing and the makeup of them. I think the CIOs that I've seen have success and take on more are the ones that have elevated themselves above the technology and can speak to the business value, the business impact. And I think I'm interested to see the CSO role of that. Not every CSO wants to do that. They, most of them, I think, are they like getting into the weeds of and are real passionate about cloud security and, fighting it's a different makeup, right? And I'm curious to see how that,
And I think I see both in the industry. And there are some who've made that transformation. I think I've done that. I'm technical and I'm business oriented. And I think the challenge is the language that you have to be able to communicate in doesn't really lend itself well to cyber nuance. And I've been trying to find good parallels. When you think about like financial risk, a company can say, look, this is how much of our income is in, a foreign currency. And so here's what our Forex risk looks like. And at the end of the day, it's bounded. If like 10% of your revenue is not in, your whatever your native currency is, then that's 10% of your revenue is at risk to weird foreign exchange rates.
Right.
In cyber, it's not really that way. Like I said, well, 90% of our systems are really well maintained. That doesn't mean that 10% of the company's revenue is at risk. It means 100% of the company is still potentially at risk,
right?
Because that 10% could kill us. That could be the unsecured interface that lets somebody get in and say, shut down our oil pipeline, which basically can put you out of business because one system had a problem. I mean, an architecture had a problem.
Well, look at the Colonial Pipeline, right?
Right. Yeah, look at any ransomware, whether it's Colonial Pipeline, whether it's Merck, Maersk, everything with NotPetya. And what you tend to see is people rely on these 90% protections. And they don't recognize that there's this 10% weakness that is tied into an architectural flaw in their other 90%, which is, I've always wondered, like, we build these systems because we don't understand the technical nuance of, oh, yes, we have one user that has administrative access everywhere, which means if the adversary compromises that user, we lose everything. And like in the finance world, you wouldn't say, oh, we have this one sales rep. No, there's nobody who controls everything.
Right. What would you say to a CSO or even a CIO, someone who's kind of, as you think about your career and kind of making that shift from security, leader and knowing all the technology to be able to speak enough business language, right? I mean, were there books you read or just an investment you made kind of in yourself and in bridging that gap that maybe you had before?
So there's a lot of books that I read. Most of them, you learn a thing out of each one of them. So I think I've read, everything by Jeffrey Moore. Almost anybody who's done research in the cognitive and behavioral space I've read, from Kahneman to Klein to Chabris, like just keep going on. But I'll say that the single biggest thing that I learned to do was whenever I had an argument with a peer executive in the company, I would say, what am I not seeing? Because this person is really passionate and they're telling me that I'm wrong. And I know I'm not wrong. Like, from what I know, I'm right. But I respect them and they think they're right. What am I not seeing? What are their motives? And there came a time, there's another leader at Akamai, Jenny Lee, that I'm sure Randall, where there were a number of things where Jenny and I were working together, and she was representing the customer point of view, and I'm representing the security point of view. And we'd sit and we'd have these conversations, and every time she would say, "No, Andy, you're not hearing me. This is why we can't do that." I would literally go take notes and think about it and say, "Oh, here's this dynamic." And so then when people would suggest something, I'd say, "Well, I suspect if we put this in front of Jenny, here's what she would say." And then I would test that out and see if she agreed. She's like, "Oh yeah, that's exactly it." I'm like, "Great, now I have a model of Jenny's customer." Right. So it really wasn't about learning how to be a better leader. It was about learning how to be another leader. And say, how can I channel the services point of view or the marketing point of view or the sales point of view? What is it when I talk to a sales rep that frustrates them about our products, so that I can then take that back and represent their point of view. And in doing that, I become this more holistic leader that understands, when I say the business, it's always sort of weird because we're all the business, but it just understands more aspects of the business.
Right.
So when you're trying to define a solution, you'd be like, oh, hey, this is the sort of thing that field marketing wants, which
Right.
is different than what brand marketing wants, which is different than what corporate marketing wants. Whereas when I first started interacting with marketing, I thought marketing was this monolithic entity.
Mm.
And I had no understanding that at the time when I went looking, which was like 10 years ago, we had 19 different marketing organizations inside the company,
Right.
each of whom had their own needs and desires.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that just inquisitiveness and to talk to different, understand different perspectives is pretty critical. It's funny. Had this conversation last couple of weeks with a number of different executives, and very few of them really. Well, I'd say this with all, you were writing a book about leadership, but they're like, I don't really read a lot of, at their age and at that much experience, they're really looking at with the stuff that they're doing are more like trying to understand maybe it's a passion project, or maybe it's something that they're interested in, or something that speaks to how. You talk to Bill Mayo over at the Broad Institute, things that are kind of relevant to healthcare,
Right.
what they're doing, and I think that is more kind of the business side of it, right? More so than like I'm going to go. I've read a lot of books about leadership. I think there's a little bit of a time and place in your career where you're kind of a sponge around leadership if that's what you want to do. I think you sounds like you kind of committed to it. I've committed to it, but in those books you read kind of are rounding things off. You're picking up a couple of sound bites here and there, but they're not necessarily like, wow, I read this thing. I'm it's at my age or maybe your age where we're going to go and change who we are because of it. It's more about kind of picking up on the I guess the more the businessy, the side of things.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Is if you look around at senior executives, they are, capstone of their leadership journey in many cases. Not all of them, but most of them have already built their leadership practice, even if it was accidental, right? They just copied the people around them. They're stuck in their ways. I think one of the horrible conceits we see in the corporate world is that those are the people that we give leadership training to, right? We go to these 3-hour offsites and we get taught about something, and most people aren't going to change their practice. They're going to say, oh, well, that's too hard to do because I've tried it before.
Right.
The people who need, and by need, I mean can value and benefit from leadership investment, honestly, the people their first day on the job. If somebody just came out of school, they just showed up, that's who we need to be hitting with leadership training, because they're eager, they're ready to learn, and they don't realize is the most junior person in a company. People are watching you. Your peers are going to look at you, and you might inspire them, or you might demotivate them. Like, you are a leader just with your attitude walking around a building.
Right.
And we don't teach them.
Yeah, I was talking to one of my teams, in their kind of, maybe second job out of school type of thing. And I said to them, I said, listen, like, you all motivate me and inspire me. I see what you do. And I need a little bit of wind in my sail every now and again.
Yeah.
I need to see what you're doing and say, wow, they're making doing that extra thing that motivates me. And I think there's kind of I think it kind of gets lost if you are this leader that you're good and you don't need anything, like seeing your team run through, just working their tails off, it makes me want to work my tail off,
Oh, absolutely. It is. In fact, that's probably, you just touched on a really important nuance that I think most people miss, is the people who are probably under the most emotional stress that you will never observe, because they're sort of like swans paddling hard underwater, but graceful on top, are the people that you might look up to as a leader. That when you look up to someone and say, oh my God, that's an amazing leader.
Right.
Especially if you look around them and say, and they stand out because the people next to them and above them are not so great leaders. Like, that's the person who most needs the emotional uplift. Right. That when you do something great and show leadership towards them, they're like, oh, this is all worthwhile.
Yeah.
Right. They're like, this is fantastic because I built this place that people can thrive, and it inspires them to keep working.
And I think this whole, the last 15 months specifically with, COVID and everything. I mean, even right now, I've got teams in India who are, really, it's terrible what they're going. It's really during these turbulent times, you see leadership for better or worse.
Yep.
I've seen a lot of great leadership. I've seen a lot of not great leadership. I've seen a lot of what I would consider kind of vacuums, right? And then it becomes, for me, a little bit of, okay, wow, I see this vacuum. Should I go fill it?
Right.
Like, why wouldn't I go fill it versus waiting for somebody else? You know what I mean? Or maybe I can have someone on the team fill it, or ask them to step in, or create these spaces where people can. I think the last 15 or so months here with COVID and everything else has been a real opportunity for, you know, these really cool situations for people to step up and lead. Because it's, you know, it's easy to lead when you're winning.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
it's, you know, it's just get out of the way, right? It's when you do go through tough times. And the other piece about this too, I think with COVID and whatnot, is every organization's had to, whether it be a reorg, whether it be a shift and go to market, all kinds of, I mean, no one's, you know, the business, great, you know, get through all that piece of it. Where's this business today, and where were we, and how do we change, and driving that change within an organization and getting people to follow, right, has been a really interesting journey for, at least for me, the past, you know, 3 to 6 months is, okay, we're going to pivot. How do I get followership behind this pivot that we're making when people are like, nah, maybe I'm not quite sure about that, you know, and the cheese got moved, and maybe, you know, things like attrition, losing good people, those things start to really.
Yeah, no, it really really changes that nature. And some people I worked for talked about being shields down, which is, you know, when everything's going smoothly, you know, your people have their shields up, like they're basically defended against anything bad happening. Like recruiter shows up, and they're like, yeah, no, I'm happy, I'm fine. You know, something, you know, bad in their world comes up, they need to take some time. Great, you know, they'll take it, they'll come back, you know. But as soon as something bad happens and those shields drop, all of a sudden, you know, things that before weren't problems for you as a leader now become a problem. Because, oh, you know, they just lost, you know, the coworker that they really loved working with. Well, now they're taking recruiter calls.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe they wouldn't have taken that recruiter call 6 months ago. And it's not that they're less bought in, but the reality is they don't think you're bought into them. Right? Because what they're not seeing is the leadership that says you value them. And that's what you have to sort of focus on and restore. It's not about getting them to make the pivot with you. It's about demonstrating that you've got their back on the pivot.
Yeah. And I think the other piece too that I've learned throughout this process is being, you know, empathy, realizing not everyone deals with everything the same way that I do.
Yep.
You know, people deal with things very differently, and to be able to give them space and be thoughtful about that. You know, I think there's so much of leadership that is just, let's go take the hill.
Yep.
You know, and let's go. And there are times right now with people being at home with you know, mental health, all this stuff that's like, I'm not like, I need a minute before I take the hill. I need you to understand that and give me the space to do that. And I think that's another thing I've tried to be a lot more thoughtful about, is how do you recognize that and be and lead a little differently, you know, with certain teams or certain people versus just, hey, let's go. Because it's not everyone is ready to go all the time, you know, especially these days. Cool. Well, Andy, I'll maybe as kind of we wrap here. I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and I appreciate it. Kind of any last words or comments? I do think this idea of like, okay, I'm a CISO and I'm being put in front of the board. Like, am I ready? My assumption is there's lots of kind of trepidation on that. And any words of advice for those people who are kind of assuming these leadership positions, specifically in, you know, in a big role? I'm sure, like, for example, Colonial Pipeline hits. I know every CISO from every pipeline company is in front of their board, or has been, to saying, could this happen to us?
Yep.
And they're, you know, to your point, it's not that it was the back of the agenda. Now it's probably the front. And they're having to really, you know, step up and lead an organization when maybe they weren't ready, or that's not what they signed up for, you know, and whatnot. But any thoughts for people and kind of during your evolution of this and how you got to where you felt comfortable in those shoes?
Yep. So I think the important things, first of all, don't ever say that you're perfectly safe, and don't ever say that the sky is falling. You'll be asked, do you have enough budget? Remember, the board doesn't give you budget. Right. Executive management does. If you're going to say no in that room, you better make sure that no has been coordinated with the CEO and CFO. You know, any message you give in the board, you cannot surprise anybody else with. But you can meet with individual directors. In fact, on most boards, you'll find that there are probably 2 or 3 directors who will be happy to meet with you, you know, offline, to talk through, hey, how should we present this? How do we make sure that we're telling the truth in a way that's accurate and helpful? Like, Obviously, you're not going to tell them, oh, this Windows server over here hasn't been patched. Like, that's not information that's at the right detail level for the board. But you can have a board mentor. In fact, you should have a board mentor if you're talking to the board. So figure out who that's going to be. I never found any director who didn't want to have the conversation with me.
Well, they want to learn from you, right? They want to learn from you. So it's a good two-way street, I think.
Yeah, and prepare both an overall summary of your company. Recognize that directors aren't full-time employees of your company. They don't know the company very well.
Right.
Even if they've been there for a while, they're paging in, they're paging out. They've got a high-level view. So have a summary you can give them offline that says, hey, just when I talk about risk, here's how we think about risk. Here's the inherent risks in our business that are unique to us. Here's what's part of our industry, just so that there's this level setting so that when you have that brief conversation in the boardroom, it can be a productive conversation.
Yeah. I think no surprises. I think, if you're being asked to speak to, a board or whoever, doing your homework, meeting with them, I think building a relationship where they want to see you successful.
Yep.
And they're your ally, and know that I think, that they want that, and I think that mentorship, and there's some, I've talked to a couple of our board members. Every time I talk to them, I always walk away with a couple things. Like, again, books and all that stuff you take glean from, but man, you talk to someone who's been in the industry for 40 years about their experiences, and they're kind of, they like mentoring for the most part. They like
absolutely
people. And so I think getting those people on your side, versus just going in as a new face to everybody. I think you can kind of hedge your bet a little bit, right? With building those relationships.
Yeah, pretty much everybody who is on a board wanted to be there, and they want to be there to help make sure that the companies that they're working with are being run well. They're not interested in running the company. They want to make sure the companies run well, which means they want you to do better.
Right.
And they will absolutely invest their time in making sure you're going to do better.
Yeah, and I think it's a great. And again, I think the no surprises thing. Nobody likes to be surprised, especially CEO, CFO. So it's having preparing appropriately, and that's probably something in life that's true.
Yeah.
No one likes surprises. I think the during COVID, I think the uncertainty was as much as from a leadership perspective, providing some level of certainty. We're here for you. Companies, I think work became a real certainty for some people during this uncertain time. So as much certainty as you can provide, I think that's another area. And the more homework you do, the more you're prepared. I think going in with that story, all right, that provides some certainty on where you're at, what you need, and everything else is really critical. So cool. Andy, it's been awesome talking to you as always. Glad to hear that you're doing some really cool new stuff, and I can't wait to read the book and get some snippets from it, and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Randall. I appreciate you having me, and always lovely chatting with you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Andy. Have a great day.